Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. The topic is Closing the Nutanix Disaster Recovery Gap. My name is David Davis, and I'm excited to be the moderator for today's event. Before we jump into the webinar, there's just a few things that you should know. First off, if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A box there at the bottom of your console. We encourage your questions. We want this to be an educational event, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. I want to thank our friends at Nutanix and Expedient. They've provided some great resources for you that correspond to today's event topic. So take a moment there and check those out in your console. And then finally, the webinar is being recorded, so keep an eye out for the link for the replay of today's event. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and kick off the webinar. I'm excited to introduce you to today's expert presenters. Today, we'll be hearing from Mr. Sam Larson, who's the Director of Product Engineering and Supplier Strategy at Expedient. And then we have AJ Kuftic, who's the Field CTO at Expedient. And then finally, Mr. Stuart Gallie, who's a Service Provider Systems Engineer at Nutanix. Sam, AJ, and Stuart, it's great to have you on the webinar today. Let's go ahead and kick it off with today's first question. This is going to be a great discussion, conversation style here. So the problem that we're talking about, in my opinion, it doesn't always get the attention really that it deserves until it's too late, unfortunately, and you hear about it in the news. More specifically, we're talking about disaster recovery. What happens when tools and hardware that you've been counting on are no longer available or affordable? And I want to direct the first question to you, Sam, and that is, what are you seeing out there in the industry with your customers? Where are they seeing the most pain around this?
So I think there's two kind of parallel events that are happening that are making this really interesting right now. One of them is that the stakes just keep going up. The cost of downtime is going up year over year. I think the latest study that Splunk did had the cost of downtime at almost $1 million an hour on average for organizations. And then the risks that are causing downtime are growing. IT teams are strapped. We're throwing so much at them that they're just juggling and trying to keep up. And so DR isn't optional anymore. It's not an insurance policy. It's a critical process that every organization needs to be good at and confident in. But a lot of organizations aren't there. They have gaps. They're partially covered, or they've done like a partial test. And that's where the other thing that comes in and makes it really hard for CIOs right now, because they're battling new demands on their teams for AI apps and a hardware and software supply chain that's heavily disrupted. So even achieving their goals with their production networks is difficult, much less DR, which, like you said, it's not the squeaky wheel. It doesn't get the attention it deserves until it's too late frequently. And so it's a lot for them to juggle. So those are the things that the problems they're dealing with. One of the trends I think we've started seeing is that some organizations who have DR, just because they can't get hardware to complement their production, they're pulling their DR data centers, they're getting rid of that, moving DR to the cloud, taking all that DR hardware and using it to complement their production so that they can scale out that way. It's interesting times for sure.
Yes, absolutely. Sounds like a whole lot of a little bit of chaos maybe going on. Stuart, I'm curious about, from your perspective at Nutanix, how are your customers thinking about DR today, and what should they be thinking about? What are the gaps?
Yeah, thanks, David. From what we're seeing at Nutanix, there's been a real shift in how organizations think about DR and business continuity. As Sam, said about insurance policies, DR, was treated almost like an insurance policy, something you invested in, put on the shelf, and hoped you never needed it. Well, today that's changed. Downtime isn't just an IT issue anymore. It has, very real business consequences, and leadership teams are paying a lot more attention to it. With the retirement of Zyleap last year, a lot of Nutanix customers have found themselves reevaluating their DR strategy. In the past, organizations felt comfortable replicating data to a secondary site and calling it good. But today's environments are much more complex than they were even a few years ago. The biggest gap I see is around validation and readiness. Many organizations have modern applications running in distributed environments, but their DR plans haven't evolved at the same pace. The conversation really needs to move beyond the simple data replication. The question isn't, can I copy my data somewhere else? It's, can I actually recover my business applications quickly and consistently when I need to? That's where a lot of customers are focusing their efforts today. David?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've heard a lot of stories in the news, even about companies that had a disaster recovery plan and had their data, but they couldn't get those applications restored in a timely manner. AJ, what kind of challenges have you seen around DR?
I think the big one that we're seeing is this has now made its jump from just an IT thing to a business thing. And that's where, Sam mentioned the insurance piece there. We're moving away from just, I need to check the box to I need this to actually work. And for a lot of organizations, that's hard. They've never done a full DR test where they actually fail everything over. They just kind of do a little fudge test. Hey, we're going to replicate some things we wouldn't bring up in a real scenario, but we do that in an effort to make sure that it is able to work in that time frame. But now the business is more involved. This is now part of risk assurance, not even cyber insurance, but full risk insurance at a much higher level. And so now the business is asking, hey, if we actually had to fail over, could you do it? How quickly could you do that? And then with modern applications, that changes the structure. And so for a lot of organizations, it's led to a lot of talk about what to do, but it still remains, disaster recovery still remains this really low priority because so many other things we have to do this right now because the business is demanding it. And so trying to prioritize that and bring that to the forefront is difficult to do business-wise, yet the business is still demanding a better outcome when the worst day of your career comes to pass.
And to add something to that, AJ, they're asking, prove that you can do it from an insurance perspective.
Yep.
So
there's
that brings
level
in
of proof.
the testing. Yeah. Yep.
And not only that, but when we start to see this shift in urgency, the number of times we've had a client have a near miss, a near hit, let's call it. Near miss is a terrible term, but where they have a disaster that could have been way worse, but things were fixed in time, that's what starts to drive that urgency of like, okay, what happens if this were worse? And that's where some of the investment comes in. We actually had, I'm not kidding, a client, we were discussing, some data center migration things, and they had 2 data centers within a not terribly far distance. We're talking about 5 to 10 miles maybe. And while we were in the middle of the meeting, everybody's phones goes off for a tornado warning, and a tornado went directly between the 2 data centers. And all of a sudden, the DR conversation got real interesting and really highly prioritized almost immediately. So these are the sorts of things where the business sees, hey, we have to do this. Let's keep moving, and puts that investment where it really needs to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's great that this has risen to such a high level at most organizations. But I know, like you said, it's always competing with other priorities that the company has to juggle. Let's move on and talk about the hardware shortage that's going on in the industry right now. I think everyone's aware that the industry as a whole is plagued by these long lead times and procurement delays for new hardware. How is that affecting DR, Stuart?
Yeah, this has had a surprisingly big impact on disaster recovery because, when budgets and hardware become constrained, production naturally gets prioritized. If servers and storage are taking months to arrive, whatever equipment becomes available is usually allocated to support growth, customer-facing services, or strategic projects. DR often ends up getting the back end, the tail end of everything, and being shifted to the bottom of the list. So, as a result, we see some organizations relying on aging infrastructure for their DR environments. The challenge is you're essentially depending on your oldest or lease strategic hardware to support you in a worst case scenario. Go figure. That's one of the reasons, cloud-based DR has gained so much attention. An Expedient Nutanix cloud target removes that dependency on hardware procurement altogether. So, instead of waiting for equipment, installing it and maintaining it, and the fact that it sits idle most of the time, organizations can access capacity immediately and scale as needed. So it changes the conversation from hardware management to business resilience. David?
I like that. Yeah. And Sam, I'm curious, is Expedient having any sort of hardware shortages as well, like customers are?
So yeah, we're buying from the same hardware market as everyone else, but we do have some advantages that customers don't have access to. One, because this is our business, we monitor it very closely and are very attuned to leading indicators on where the market is going. And we work with multiple suppliers to reduce risk. And specifically in this instance, we saw it coming, bought ahead, and are operating. We always operate from an inventory, so that's a big advantage, but we're operating from an expanded inventory now, which allows us to deliver. And because we're buying ahead of the price increase curve as well, which helps. And then, of course, because we're operating a cloud business, we're buying t-shirt size nodes and we're buying them in bulk, which helps a lot as well. And then another thing I wanted to add there is just that as we talk to customers about this, and this has been a major driver of conversation. It's like, I can't get hardware. I need to find it somewhere. And service provider outsourcing is, or Expedient Cloud is just one of the options they're looking at. But it's not just that the price is up and it's unavailable. They're also being hit for tons of new AI projects, and there's been software supply chain disruption at the same time. So they're just in complete chaos, looking for help.
AJ, I'm curious, can Expedient help solve some of these problems, or what are you hearing?
Yeah, I think what Sam mentioned about we're buying hardware at a scale that most customers don't. Most customers buy hardware once every 3 years. Maybe they add a host here and there over the course of that period of time, but we're buying hosts literally every quarter. So we have larger relationships. We span across multiple vendors. We work with folks like Nutanix on technologies to make that as consumable as possible. But we also have the ability to leverage inventory that we have on hand already. So that's something that we've been able to do with driving off of nodes that came off of other projects and are now back in our inventory that we can provide to customers. This reshapes the overall infrastructure conversation because, as Stuart mentioned, DR goes to the back of the line, right? When there's new hardware that we need to bring in and that hardware cost has gone up by 300%, DR doesn't get the 300% hardware. It gets 3-year-old hardware or even older hardware. And I think sometimes the business doesn't recognize that. They just see that you can recover or that you've done a test, and they're not thinking, hey, if we actually recover and we have to run off this for a long period of time, this is not going to go well for us. It is not going to perform the way that our new hardware does. And so I don't know that the business necessarily always recognizes that that is a distinct shift for them. I also think this is a challenge for most organizations in terms of making the business justification in terms of, hey, where do I get this hardware from? Where do I put it? Most people don't have a second data center, or they don't want to deal with that. So that's also where we come in, both for co-location and the actual hosted platform. So this is really where we work with our vendors and our clients to build out those DR solutions and then make sure they can actually recover from it when there's something bad happens.
Smart. I like that Expedient and Nutanix can help with these kind of challenges that so many companies are facing. Let's move on and talk about other disruptors, things like ransomware. I mean, it's still in the news so frequently. It's still hitting so many companies out there. I know resilience is a huge challenge. What are some other threats related to resilience that you're seeing, and what's been changing over the last 12 months, Stuart?
So, ransomware is obviously one of the biggest concerns that everybody's talking about right now, but it's not the only thing affecting operational resilience. One trend, we're watching closely is the growing dependence on AI-powered workloads. Organizations are incorporating AI into more business processes than ever before, whether that's RAG pipelines, localized language models, or automated decision-making systems. As these technologies become more deeply embedded into day-to-day operations, downtime becomes even less acceptable. If key AI services become unavailable, the entire business process can grind to a halt. The other challenge we've observed, involves, traditional hyperscale cloud DR approaches. Many organizations, initially viewed those platforms as the easy answer. But, once they started building and testing the DR solutions, they ran into unexpected costs and complexity. Moving an environment, Nutanix or otherwise, into a completely different cloud architecture, isn't always straightforward. During an outage, the last thing you want is your team spending valuable time troubleshooting network configurations, converting workloads, or dealing with unexpected charges. Simplicity becomes super important when the clock is running. David?
I love that. Yeah, you're absolutely going to need simplicity, especially in a time of chaos when you're infected with ransomware or you have some massive outage. Sam, what are you seeing out there?
So what ransomware deservedly gets a lot of the attention. It is a big problem, and the events have gotten more expensive and more frequent over time. And there's new attack vectors like AI-aided phishing. But what we're seeing in the data is that legacy, I would call them like incident types, like backhoe cutting a fiber or a power outage, are still the most common types of incidents. And so you need to have a plan for all of the above. And what I like, some of our customers have gotten good enough at DR that incidents are always unpredictable. Like, you never have the same incident twice. You try to plan to prevent the last incident, and the next one is something completely different. And if you're trying to troubleshoot and fix incidents in production, you're trying to like map your way through a new path each time, and figure out like how to get there. DR can be something that you're like really good at and you have executed it over and over again. And if you can just fail over to your second site and know it's clean and good regardless of the incident type, and then figure out what's going on in prod and fix that, it can really dramatically reduce the downtime of any type of incident. And so we've had customers do that for incident management. We've had customers do that for migrations as well. So like they wanted to migrate their prod site, fail over to DR, literally migrate production from one data center to a different one, and then fail back. And so if you can get really good at your DR function, you have that available. And then one other point I would make on ransomware specifically is that if you do DR as a service, one of the advantages is that you have control plane segregation. So like if you think about a ransomware incident, are your IT teams going to be able to log in and do the things they need to do to execute your DR? Or is their laptop going to be encrypted? Or is some critical jump box they need going to be offline? It's hard to know. If you work with a partner on DR as a service, you just call them up and say, hey, like, fail me over and wait while it happens. And that adds another layer of protection for you.
Yeah, I love that idea of using your disaster recovery solution for, a whole lot of different things, for migration, for bringing up individual services, and the idea of this protected kind of management domain or core domain. AJ, what are you seeing around resilience?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of conversations going beyond just disaster recovery and into DR and backup. That's really where ransomware has changed that DR conversation, because a lot of journaling time and restore times become lost, especially with something even like Zerto and Nutanix disaster recovery. You only have so much storage and so many snapshots of the environment that ransomware is a long lurking threat. So it gets past that like week at most, and now you're into backup territory. We've had a number of customers that we've helped recover from a disaster scenario where we used a combination of disaster recovery as a service and backups, where we were able to get them restored in a very short period of time. And I think the key thing about this is not checking a box. A lot of our most successful customers with disaster recovery do regular full failovers, not a tick the box test. They are literally running out of one side or the other for 6 months, or I have a customer who does it quarterly, where by being able to do that failover, there's no test. They know that it works. They are fully prepared. And when things don't come up when they do that failover, it's because somebody forgot to put it in the replication group or the protection group. And they're able to do that over and over again so that when it comes down to an actual disaster, there's no hesitation on hitting the button. And even when there is, they can call us and we help them do the failover and execute that. So it's an incredibly confident way to not just prepare for, but actually execute your game plan every single time.
Excellent. Excellent. I love that. So let's move off the disruptors and let's talk about what businesses can do to manage the risk and improve their digital resilience. We talked a little bit earlier about cloud-based disaster recovery. Stuart, how does cloud-based disaster recovery really resonate with Nutanix customers?
Yeah, good question there. When we talk with Nutanix customers about managed cloud DR, one of the first reactions we hear is relief. Running a secondary site on your own, means managing facilities, hardware, power, cooling, networking, and the software stack that sits on top of it. Most IT teams would rather be spending their time supporting business initiatives than, managing infrastructure they hope they'll never need to use. This also connects directly to conversations around cyber insurance and compliance. As I mentioned earlier, requirements have become much more rigorous. Organizations are increasingly being asked to demonstrate that recovery processes have been tested and validated, not just documented. That's where managed DR can provide significant value. The infrastructure, testing processes, and recovery capabilities are already built into the service model. And getting started doesn't have to be complicated. Typically the journey looks something like this. You start with assess your critical workloads and determine the appropriate recovery objectives, because there's going to be multiples. Creating an overall design of a recovery solution to meet your needs, and then replicate using native Nutanix protection capabilities or application built-in replication capabilities. Then the key is next is setting up recovery plans based on that application-centric approach so that you can recover quickly. Everybody gets the copy the data nice and easy, but it's can I recover it quickly? And then probably most importantly is validate it. Do that data testing either through, as AJ was mentioning, a full failover. And I've had customers, that fail over a week, 2 weeks, and fell back. But to AJ's point, yeah, some of them will run for a whole quarter. Or just non-disruptive testing, to verify everything performs as expected without impacting your production. The goal is to, improve resilience without, forcing customers to completely change how they operate. David?
I like that. And Sam, what can you tell us about Expedient's disaster recovery as a service solution, specifically for Nutanix environments?
Yeah, for Nutanix environments, there's two main components. It starts with Expedient's Nutanix private cloud solution. That is your disaster recovery infrastructure. And it is a fully dedicated private cloud, so you can run workloads there all the time, treated just like any other private cloud. And then on top of that, we layer on disaster recovery as a service, managed service. And I like to think of it as outcome as a service, because as part of that, we are going to ensure you have a successful test up front and then biannual successful DR tests throughout the life of the contract. We're going to help you with planning, like Stuart said, there's different approaches to testing, so help you figure out how you want to test. Monitor between tests to make sure everything's running as it should, tune it over time, and just make sure that you're successful and confident that you're always going to succeed when you want to go to DR. We have optional bursting options, which are hard to achieve on your own for clients who want to have like a pilot light environment and expand out during tests and failovers. So it's a very popular service.
Excellent. I love that. Sounds like a great push button solution for Nutanix customers out there. Let's move on and talk about the economics of disaster recovery. Is it possible to see a cost comparison or like a breakdown of cloud-based DR versus owning your own secondary site and managing your own DR? Sam, is that possible?
I don't have slides or anything, but I can definitely talk through that. So it's important to think through like everything that goes into your costs when you're thinking about going to cloud, just in general, to make sure you have a reasonable comparison. So to do it yourself, you're going to quote hardware today, probably get it in 3 to 6 months. Then you're going to have project to deploy that hardware and then deploy DR on top of that and plan and test. You're probably looking at a 6 to 12 month project. To be successful, you need a second co-location, so you don't have that, you're shopping for it. Second network, connectivity between your office and your production data center and your DR data center. Labor to do all of this, and you're really on your own for planning and testing all of those things. So with a hosted solution, you don't have to shop for hardware that's included. You don't have to shop for a facility. You don't have to shop for all those other second colo, second network. You just have an environment that you can start replicating to. And if you have a DR as a service management on top of that, like you said in the last segment, like you're walking away from the implementation project very quickly with a push button DR, and just knowing that when you want to go, you click the button and your business fails over successfully, or you call and someone else does it for you. And there's, in addition to all of those like cost generating factors you have to deal with doing it yourself, there's some other things that just no matter what, you can never achieve yourself. So if you're planning DR for your organization, you're doing this once, it's n equals 1. Like this is our DR. If you're working with a provider to do it, they might have hundreds, thousands of clients. They're testing multiple customers every week throughout the year. They may have been doing this for 20 years, like Expedient has. They face countless real events. And so there's just a lot of experience and learnings that they can bring to the table that you just don't have any chance of ever learning, except for learning the hardware on your own when you don't want to. And another nice thing is that it's like, we've talked about how critical DR is for organizations, but also how it's not the squeaky wheel and it's not their number one priority. It's 2 or 3, and they keep getting redirected to the things that are loud today. If you outsource it to a DR as a service provider, it is their number one priority. It is their critical business workload. And in the case of Expedient, it's coming with a 100% uptime guarantee and payments back to you if we fall short on anything. So like, there's nothing that could be more critical to us. So it's quicker. It covers like, it erases a lot of costs. And another thing in like, that's unique to this time and the supply chain disruption is it also gives you some flexibility on your cost accounting. A lot of capital budgets are being blown up by hardware prices tripling and quadrupling and 10xing. And it gives you an operating expense option. It doesn't have to be OpEx, but an operating expense option for one of your solutions, for another one of your solutions.
Excellent. Excellent. I like that. And Stuart, what are you seeing around cost comparisons with Nutanix customers for disaster recovery as a service?
Yeah, Sam covered, all the major aspects, key financial considerations. And when organizations really break down the numbers, the economics of maintaining a dedicated secondary site on their own, can be challenging to justify. Hardware itself is only part of the equation. There's, as Sam said, there's licensing costs, connectivity, facility costs, power, cooling. But, a big aspect is, all of the ongoing maintenance that you as a customer would have to burden to maintain that DR on your own. That's you spending money on an environment that you may never use. And, perhaps more importantly, they could be spending time, managing something else. Every hour spent patching, testing, maintaining, troubleshooting a recovery site is time that isn't being spent on strategic initiatives. That's why, many organizations are evaluating and moving to cloud-based DR models. It allows them to move towards a more predictable operational expense while freeing up both capital and engineering resources, for projects that directly support the business growth.
Excellent, excellent. And AJ, when you zoom out from just looking at the line item, of the hardware and the software, and you look at total business risk, how can customers, estimate that?
That's a really hard discussion, and there are many consulting agencies that would love to talk through that, because when you get into risk, there's so many different components that play into the entire process of how a company goes from, quote to cash. I think the big thing when you zoom out is how much of your staff time can you assign or put towards disaster recovery? And for most organizations, that's next to none. It is a thing that is done to keep the lights on, much like operating system patching. It's on top of every single thing. When we look at DIY versus what we're doing, the thing that always breaks out to me is we do this as a service. This is what we have inside of our costs is people, time, and energy. And Sam touched on it a little bit, but we have multiple hundreds of DR tests a year. We have seen every single weird little thing like SQL Server 2016 can't be replicated this way when it's configured this particular way. And you get access to all of that knowledge. And you get access to people who do this all the time. Most people do a test once a year at best. We do them once a week. And so you get access to expertise. You get access to extra hands because most staffs are not getting bigger. Everybody's staff is getting smaller. And so when you look at it, you're not just getting the actual resources and the secondary site and all the other components that go into that, but also more hands and more time to actually make this work versus just trying to put some things in place and hoping for the best.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, hand it off to the experts. You test disaster recovery every single week. Most businesses rarely ever find time to test it at all. So, AJ, I think the last question here is for you before we jump into our Q&A, and that is for organizations out there that haven't tested their disaster recovery plans, let's say in the last 12 months, what do you recommend that they do this week?
This week, you should call us and let's actually have a discussion as to why. Because that's really what it comes down to. Have you done it because you don't feel like you have the time to, that you don't know what will happen if you do? Those are the sorts of things that are massive risks that no one is taking into consideration. What would happen if your main DR person, whoever that might be in your organization, was not available? Let's say that they have won the lottery and they have decided that an island life is for them. What would you do in that situation? If you're an organization, have you done a DR test without your main SME being involved? And that's where we really come in, because we have SMEs across the board. We work with you on building out that run book. And part of the initial process on this journey is we sit down with you and talk about how are you doing it today and how can you do it better? And what is needed to make this the most recoverable platform possible and reach your RPO and RTO needs. So let's talk. And we'll work with our friends over at Nutanix with Stuart, and you get to work with folks like Sam on how to actually build out the best DR capabilities and not, hey, I'm going to go buy some hardware and hope I can figure it out over the holiday weekend.
I love that. Excellent, actionable advice. That's all the time we have here in our discussion. Let's now move on to our Q&A round. If anyone out there in the audience has questions, now's the time to get them in. Let's jump to Q&A. All right, we're kicking off our Q&A here.
Where is it?
We've got Sam, Stuart, and AJ, and we've got our first audience question coming in live. This question is from Noni in the audience, who's asking if ransomware sneaks into the system well before a disaster, I'm guessing it says, won't it just replicate straight into the DR site? And if so, how do we stop this from happening? AJ, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what I mentioned earlier. You're not going to stop it from getting in. If ransomware is going to get in, it's going to get in. And the replication is difficult to stop. We've actually had customers go through this before where they get ransomware, they try to do a DR failover, they can't because the other side's been infected, right? What you're talking about happens, and it happens fairly often. That's why when we start talking about DR, when we're designing for something like ransomware, it's not just here is the tool that is replicating my VMs from point A to point B, or my applications from point A to point B. It's a lot of the tools that we have, even Nutanix DR and VMware-based tools, have a journal. And that journal can only be so long because otherwise you're taking up space for a bunch of snapshots that you're not really using. That's why we bring in backup tools. So that's why we pair that with our cloud data protection to have the long-term retention while also having the active replication in place for things like natural disasters where I need to be up as fast as possible. And so when we combine those two things together, we've been really successful at getting people back up and running, especially from things like ransomware attacks.
Excellent. Excellent. Great solution. Here's another good question that came in. They want to know if they're running Nutanix AHV but haven't moved off VMware for all workloads yet, can Expedient protect both? Sam?
Yes, Expedient can protect both. We have Nutanix-based and VMware-based cloud solutions for customers, and both offer the same DR as a service. Obviously, the technology is a little bit different. It works a little bit different under the hood, but it's the very similar experience from a management standpoint, similar overall functionality. It works great. One of the really advantages of running an Expedient cloud is the ability to run a hybrid VMware Nutanix environment if that's what your organization is doing, and whether DR or not.
That's great that you have that flexibility. Another good question, they want to know, how does Expedient help us with our cyber insurance proof for DR?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of times that proof is, hey, can you prove that you have done a test? Can you prove that you have done a recovery? That's where working with us, we have a run book. We will provide evidence of the test. We will provide the reports that say, this is the test that we ran, and here's how successful it was. Part of being able to help with cyber insurance proof is that it works regularly. And so that's part of working with us is that we do DR tests. We build DR solutions for customers literally every single day. So as part of that, you know that you're working with somebody who has done this before, who's done it a few times this week. And so that is a confidence builder. And then when we actually get into the failover and testing and then the reporting side of it, we know what most auditors or compliance folks are asking for when it comes to asking for proof. We do this fairly often. So we're able to provide the full report back to you and say, this is how we did the test. Here are the results of that test. Here's how everything failed over. And we're able to prove all that out as part of that. So really it's helping you with that paperwork and knowing what is going to be asked for.
Yeah, I love how comprehensive that is. I know a lot of companies could really use that. Let's see. Next good question. They want to know what happens if we want to move our DR back to our data center. Is there lock-in? Sam?
Good question. No, there is no lock-in. You can fail over to your Expedient DR cloud as frequently as often, fail back as soon as you want. We have customers who fail over and back once a year as part of a test, twice a year as part of their test. We have customers who do it every quarter and just run one quarter in their Expedient DR solution and then the next quarter back in their prod, and really everywhere in between. And there's, it's the same process to fail either direction.
Yeah, it's not a one-way street. And we built the solution specifically so that you could fail back, right? We were trying to handle natural disasters where my prod lives here because I have a bunch of users here. I have my physical gear here and I need DR for some applications, or I need to have something for compliance purposes. That is what we built our things to do, but we built it to specifically also fail back.
No Hotel California, as they say. I like that. Yeah, if anyone has a question out there, now's the time to get it in. We've got a lot of great questions coming in, so keep them coming. We want to answer your questions. Next question, I think this one's a good one for you, Stuart. They want to know, what's the most common thing you see happen to organizations that delay their DR testing?
Yeah, without a doubt, I'd probably say, the reason for the delays is, we're not ready, or now's not the time, we're too busy. And this is, largely driven by configuration drift. Think of how often your production environment's changing. You're adding new VMs, you're patching servers, you're tweaking firewall rules. If you aren't maintaining and, testing regularly, your DR environment will quickly fall out of sync. That's when you see a recovery fail when it's most needed. That's when you realize you're not even ready to do a DR test. And, that's why it's important to have a partner maintaining your DR solution for you, like Expedient.
Excellent. Good point. Another one here, similar for you, Stuart. They want to know, is it a problem if our production and DR sites are in the same city?
I'll say this, having a DR site in the same city is definitely better than having no DR site at all. But it does leave you exposed to, shared regional risks. If a matter occurs, a severe weather event, a flood, power grid failure hits your city, there's a good chance that it's going to hit both your data centers and they'll go dark at the same time. So, the gold standard for DR is geographic diversity, putting your recovery site in a completely different failure domain so that one localized disaster can't take out your entire operation.
Good point.
We run into this fairly often. There are reasons why people keep their DR in the same city. It's usually latency reasons. I need to have my things in a certain latency gap, because I can't have something if I'm based in New York, I can't be doing my DR out of Phoenix because all the additional latency causes performance problems in my app. That happens. However, consider, as Stuart mentioned, power failures, consider natural disaster possibilities. We have a data center in Memphis, Tennessee. We had a lot of customers who are in that region who are affected by tornadoes on a regular basis. And so having a data center that is outside of your general area is going to be more beneficial to you. We've also had clients who go, it's interesting, they run their prod with us and they do their DR back to on-prem. We've had a couple of those before, and the reason they do that is usually it is a tornado that doesn't affect their direct location, but it affects down the road and it takes out their external connectivity and they need to keep doing business. So they will recover to DR on-prem so that they can keep their manufacturing facility running or something along those lines. So we will work with you on those and on that design. And we also want to talk about, what are your disaster fears? What is the thing that you're designing around? Not just potentially ransomware, but also like, hey, we have two different data centers, as I mentioned earlier. We had a customer with two data centers in Dallas, and a tornado went between them. It's like, you can't really sell that any harder. That you should probably have another data center not in Dallas. So consider those things as part of it.
Yeah, great points. And I mean, I think we talked about as well, you don't want to have your primary and backup or disaster recovery site in Miami, because they could both get hit by a hurricane at the same time. So good points all around. Next question. They're asking about this co-managed model. What does that mean day to day? Who handles testing, runbooks, and failover execution? AJ?
So from a co-management standpoint, that is we have access and you have access. You have every ability to execute your own tests, execute the failover, push the button whenever you want to. The reason we call it co-managed is that when you don't want to do that or you need help doing that, we're here and we can jump in and help. We have a copy of the run book because if for whatever reason you need us to press the button because the person who's your SME is won the lottery and is no longer with the company, there's an ability for us to help you execute that failover. That is the biggest benefit in my mind of working with a DR as a service provider, because it is not tied to this is the one person who knows how to do this thing. It's tied to a group of people who know how to do this all the time and will execute your runbook. From a co-management standpoint, we take care of the hardware. So we'll patch the hardware, or we'll take care of firmware. We'll take care of hardware failures. We deal with patching the hypervisor, the management layer, handle any, interoperability things with the disaster recovery. We work with you. So if you're replicating from on-prem to us and your Prism Central version on-prem is at a certain version, we can't go beyond a version because of interoperability. So we work with you on that. It's not, hey, we're upgrading, you got to upgrade your stuff too. We work with you on that. So it's taking care of a lot of the low level things, even things down to like the data center and the cooling. That's our responsibility. But you still have the admin rights to go in and do the things that are important to you and allow you to take control when you need to.
Excellent. Another good question here. They're saying our CFO is hard to convince to buy new monthly services. Do you have any suggestions on how they can make that business case? AJ?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would ask is, okay, what's the financial risk of a disaster event? Do you know that? Start there. Because if you can't say that there is a regulatory requirement to do that, we've had customers who are like, hey, we have to make our DR better because regulation wise, we're a publicly traded company. We have to do better here. That's one reason. But if you are the CFO of the company and you're saying, hey, we're trying to get the money or the funding to do DR, the answer is always, what is the financial risk? If your systems are down for longer than a day, what do you do? Right now with hardware timelines being as long as they are, if you're not having the conversation now about somebody like Expedient or a DR as a service provider being able to handle that for you, getting hardware right now is taking forever. So if all of your hardware is taken out, you can't just call up, name your IT hardware provider here and get new hardware tomorrow. It's going to be months before you get it, no matter how much you say this is really, really, really important. So that's another opportunity to say, hey, this is mitigating financial risks to the business. There are risk management companies and consulting companies out there that can walk that through, and they will point out things that you didn't realize were a thing. But all of this is in support of maintaining the business long term. So that's another thing to put out there, is that this isn't, yes, this is a cost. Yes, there is a function that you have to go through to do that. But you, from a business case standpoint, is how much time is it going to take? How many people is it going to take? Sometimes if you say like, hey, we need 3 more people to make this work properly, that's one way to do it. The other one is, hey, what happens if we don't? If we don't do anything and a disaster happens, what do we do? And if the answer is we're kind of screwed and we should all be polishing up our resumes, there's your financial risk. And that means the business is going under and you're going to have a whole lot of people who are not going to have jobs soon. So put that risk out there. And it's really what a CFO will understand, what a CEO will understand, because they don't understand the technology, and nor should they. They understand risk. They understand sustainability of the business. They understand how that impacts their ability to make money. So if you can hit on those things to build that business case, you'll take things a whole lot further than you have before.
Very well said. And before we wrap up here, unless the audience has any further questions, I want to ask this one final question is what should people do to learn more and get started with this joint Expedient Nutanix solution, AJ?
Let's talk. Reach out to us. I'm sure there's going to be some contact information that goes out. Let's talk. Expedient.com. There's a Let's Talk button at the top of the page. And we can go through and sit down and walk through, what are you doing today? What do you want to do better? What do we see as an ability to do better? We work with our friends at Nutanix, with Stuart, on building out solutions on our side. We can also do things on-prem, and also do hybrid, where you're on-prem replicating into us. This might also be an opportunity to look at it from a more holistic standpoint, look at it from prod and DR to do things at an even higher level. So let's actually have that conversation. I think that's the next step. And we can also, for those of you who are asking about how do I make this business case, that's where we help. That's what we do. So we will help you walk through that business case and get to where you need to be.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have in our Q&A session here. I want to give a big thank you to our expert presenters, Sam, AJ, and Stuart, and of course to our sponsors, Expedient and Nutanix. That concludes today's webinar. Big thank you to our audience for joining us on the event today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you on our next event. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.